Vanilla WoW was meant to have 30 dungeons, and 6 of those were meant to be beginner dungeons. That's right, the vanilla WoW you know launched with 20 dungeons. That's quite a lot, but there was meant to be much more. We're going to deep dive all those intricate little abandoned concepts that never made it to vanilla and never even made it to alpha or beta. Now, there are 8 races in World of Warcraft, but at the time when all of the stuff was being conceptualized, there were only 6 races. Trolls and gnomes were added later on. They weren't meant to be part of the playable OG races for vanilla WoW. They did of course make it in alpha and well before these dungeons were scrapped. So if they were designed at the time, we likely would have still only had 6 beginner dungeons because the trolls and gnomes shared the starting zones with orcs and dwarves. But let's list off the 6 beginner dungeons. We have the gold mine for humans. We have the excavation site for dwarves. We have Ashenvale ruins for the night elf. We have the monastery for the Forsaken, at the time known as the Scourge. We have Skull Rock for the orcs, and then we have Razorfen for the Tauren. And now some of those dungeons you heard eventually morphed into and became other well-known dungeons that we know in the current modern day and age. For example, Monastery became Scarlet Monastery and was split into Shadowfang Keep at the same time. Whereas we have Skull Rock, which very likely became Ragefire Chasm. Now, that's not a confirmation, but it's essentially around the same location, so it does make sense. And Ashenvale Ruins became Black Fathom Deeps. But as I said at the very beginning, a lot of these concepts changed and shifted and became completely different or alien things to the original intention. For example, with the Forsaken, at the time they were simply called the Scourge, and they had Monastery. There was no Shadowfang Keep, and Cathedral, which became Scarlet Cathedral and Scarlet Monastery, was its own separate instance. Now, the Monastery was likely meant to be a Scarlet Monastery, and the Scarlet Cathedral was very likely meant to be a raid, and both were meant to be separate locations. We had Monastery shift into a completely different idea, and I'll go into more detail on that later on. Now, they cancelled these 30 dungeons because Vanilla WoW's whole goal was to make too much content, and they just kept making content until they ran out of time. So of these 30 dungeons, most of them never saw the light of day, and most of them were scrapped and different dungeons or different ideas took their place. We're discussing the 6 starter dungeons which were scrapped, as well as a few mid-level dungeons. I'm not going to dive into the mid-level dungeons too much, but I do want to touch on them because it does tie into the starter dungeons. Now, another thing to consider is that dungeons were originally meant to be open world. That's right, the dungeons that we have today, the instance dungeons, were not part of pre-alpha conceptualization. The reason we have instance dungeons is actually because the world kept changing. So when they made a location and they put doodads down, the design team would end up expanding the zone, expanding the world, and that dungeon and every single doodad would have to move. But guess what? There was no select all button. So you had to individually move every single doodad. And on top of that, the doodad tool was broken. So when they put a doodad down, it went to the ceiling of the dungeon and they had to manually drag it around into position. So making a dungeon was a nightmare. And then the devs, the developers, the art team, everybody got together, nobody agreed, and somebody created a new and unique way of instancing off a dungeon so that you did not have to move every single art asset and doodad after it was placed. So in this original world, all 6 of these starter dungeons were meant to be open world locations. In fact, every single dungeon was meant to be an open world location. But that got scrapped and we got dungeons, and that became the future of essentially World of Warcraft as we know it. But we are going to start with the Eastern Kingdoms because that was the continent that was finished first. They started with the Eastern Kingdoms and then rushed Kalimdor. Now, I need to make one final clarification. I apologize, we're going to start soon. But essentially everything I say, you may find traces of it within World of Warcraft currently, whether it was scrapped, changed, or readapted. Now, the reason for that is World of Warcraft and Warcraft 3 were being designed side by side. Warcraft 3 was much further ahead, and World of Warcraft's Team 2 started slightly after the fact. So certain things ended up changing, being developed and redeveloped and moved and removed because they had to adapt based off the world Chris Metzen was building in Warcraft 3, and then they had to go and fix it in World of Warcraft. Now then, let's just dive right into it. The Gold Mine, the human starting dungeon. Many of you may not know this, but every single Alliance player for the most part has actually played in and enjoyed the very first dungeon for all of the Alliance, and that is Fargo Deep Mine in Elwyn Forest. It was meant to be a dungeon. and to a degree it still technically is. Now, you don't really go in there multiple times to kill Goldtooth or bosses or things of that nature, because it was scaled down to become a zone inside of a zone. It was a little quest hub. You go in there, collect your candles, kill the kobolds, kill Goldtooth, things of that nature. It's also a location where most people experience their first death, because as an Alliance player, you go in there overconfident, get run over by kobolds, and you die. Your candle snuffed out. Let's talk about Fargo Deep Mine, or the Gold Mine, about how it was initially meant to be, which was a dungeon. Multifaceted, multiple bosses, multiple locations and instances. Now we can see in game that they clearly stopped putting that much effort into it, and they put a lot more effort into places like the Dead Mines or other areas after the fact, because again, they realized that they could not redo the Gold Mine because the world kept changing. And instead of re-instancing and redesigning it, they just moved on. Now that's not factual, but that's what I assume happened with the Gold Mine, because they clearly scrapped these original 6 starter dungeon ideas and moved on to other bigger dungeons. But let's discuss the next one, the Dwarves, the excavation site. Now, the excavation site, at least based off what I can tell, is meant to be inside of Loch Madan. It's essentially what we know as Ironband's excavation site. Now that's not factual, but I think the original concept of the excavation site just became a little quest hub inside of Loch Madan. Now if you look at the OG map of Vanilla when it was being developed or pre-development in pre-alpha, you could see that Dun Morogh and Loch Madan and Grim Batol and the wetlands were much smaller, because in the original design, the Dwarven territories were a very thin strip of Eastern Kingdoms. That ginormous Dun Morogh that we have in Vanilla wasn't part of the plan when they were designing all of this stuff initially. In fact, take a look at this pre-vanilla, pre-alpha development map, and take a look at this Warcraft 2 map right here. And you can see when put side by side, you can see what their intentions were. Now, the Dwarven excavation site was clearly meant to tie into Uldaman and then into Grim Batol and all those Dwarven shenanigans about exploring and uncovering the mysteries of Azeroth, and then eventually into Uldum and whatnot. Now, a lot of those story beats and plot points got stopped in half or just abandoned, but that was the original intention behind the Dwarf starting dungeon. Now, was Ironband's excavation site the dungeon idea? Probably not exactly one for one, but that's the closest thing I can find that may have been the excavation site that the dwarves were meant to have as the starting dungeon. So now we have the monastery, and as we know it, and as I said, it was split into Shadowfang Keep and the Scarlet Crusade, or the Scarlet Monastery. But initially, we had the cathedral, the Scarlet Cathedral, as its own separate thing, and then we had the Scarlet Monastery as the leveling zone, the leveling dungeon for the Forsaken. Now, at the time when they were developing all this stuff, again, like I said, they were doing all of this at the same time as Warcraft 3 and the Frozen Throne, and the Forsaken were called the Scourge. They were not called the Forsaken as of yet. And I don't know if the Forsaken story beats had been written as of this moment. But don't quote me on that. It may have meant to be called the Scourge from the very beginning and the Forsaken came about later. I'm not sure what the original plans were. Keep in mind, this shit was written in 1999, if not early 2000s, maybe even before that. Nonetheless, they ended up merging the monastery and the cathedral into one instance, the Scarlet Monastery, and then they recreated the Shadowfang Keep down south inside of its own zone in Silverpine Forest. So it makes me wonder what the difference between the cathedral and the monastery were meant to be. Clearly one was going to be a raid or an endgame zone of a dungeon of some kind versus the level up dungeon. We never did get that cathedral. Cathedral and monastery merged into one. Or maybe Tyr's Hand was meant to be the cathedral and ended up moving it later on, but then they ran out of time to make it a dungeon or a raid. There are so many parts of the vanilla and pre-vanilla and pre-alpha and all that stuff that just changed and shifted so many times that story beats are hard to track down and figure out in true detail. Now though, we are going to move on to Kalimdor. Beautiful, lovely Kalimdor. Now, Kalimdor was rushed because Eastern Kingdoms kept having problems and issues which kept making them delay things and rush things and just do things in a much faster manner because they were developing an MMO from scratch for the very first time. It's why Kalimdor seems a bit more rushed and where there's so many more kill quests versus the humans and the starting zones in the Eastern Kingdoms, because those were developed and they had time. For example, the quest line inside that 4 zones interconnected, letting you travel back and forth, sending letters. If you read those quests, they're very interesting, very juicy, very full and chock full of details. Whereas the Horde zones in the Kalimdor, just kill this, get me 10 of this, kill 20 of this, get 300 of this. They didn't have time to make detailed quest lines. In fact, Kalimdor was given a much bigger design scope and like size compared to its original intentions. If you look at the OG maps of Kalimdor, it was maybe 3/4 or half the size of the Eastern Kingdoms. Now, did they make it bigger so they could add more kill quests because it was simpler than designing close, tight-knit locations? Maybe. I don't exactly know why they made Kalimdor so much bigger than it actually is in their original plans. Nonetheless, we have Skull Rock, the Orc starting dungeon. Now, as I said, this may have turned into Ragefire Chasm, but it's kind of debatable. Like, I'm not going to lie to you guys. If you look at the OG map, Skull Rock was northeast of Orgrimmar, not inside Orgrimmar. So, does that mean that Durotar was both above and below Orgrimmar? Was Orgrimmar always meant to be at the very top of Durotar, connecting to Ashenvale and all that? We don't actually know. Again, like I said, this was all designed before the Warcraft 3 campaign, the bonus Orc campaign, even began. So, it does show us this mysterious alternate look at what these dungeons and locations were meant to be. Nonetheless, Skull Rock very likely did become Ragefire Chasm. It has that same theme, that same kind of naming scheme. So, I'm just going to say, for the sake of this, that it did become Ragefire Chasm. But if it didn't, I expect it to still be some kind of demon dungeon, some orcs that rebelled, maybe some leftover demon orcs, things of that nature. But again, there's not much more information to go off of. That's all we really have. So we're going to move on to the Night Elves and the Ashenvale Ruins. Now, the Ashenvale Ruins were initially up north in where the Moonglade was meant to be. The initial plans, the Moonglade, Ashenvale, Darkshore, all was part of one ginormous zone based off the looks of the Warcraft 3 map. Now again, it's called the Ashenvale Ruins, but it's up where Moonguard was meant to be. And then in fact, if you look at the map of Warcraft 3, of Vanilla, it's essentially at a location called the Ruins of Mathistra. I do want to clarify, I said Moonguard, I meant the Moonglade, but I'm tired, it's midnight, and I'm recording this, so it is what it is. But like I said, they changed and shifted so much that locations kept changing, zones, map ideas, where things should be, how zones should be placed, how the map should be spread out. So many things changed in Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms that the pre-alpha map versus the Warcraft 3 or the vanilla map are completely separate and different things. Nonetheless, Ashenvale Ruins became Black Fathom Deeps. That is a fact. That's not a maybe, that is actually what happened. In fact, in early vanilla, in early alpha, the Ruins of Mathistra little location took you to Black Fathom Deeps. They ended up moving the Black Fathom Deeps location from the Ruins of Mathistra down to Ashenvale later on. In fact, that old location in the Ruins of Mathistra is actually called Old Black Fathom Deeps locale. So we know for a fact that it used to be Black Fathom Deeps. Now, what made them move it from there to Ashenvale? I don't know. I don't know what the design process of that was. Maybe Black Fathom Deeps was meant to be like Ragefire Chasm, a level 9 to 15 dungeon, and then they chose to make it a level 20 plus dungeon later on. The plans and ideas of the OG devs is wild, and so much changed. And I said that so many times during this video, but it's true. We were meant to have 30 dungeons. In fact, we only got 20. And the devs themselves even considered 20 to be way more content the player base needed. Vanilla WoW launched as an MMO with too much content. The first of its kind at the time, because most of the MMOs, you had to make your own content. You had to go and grind for it. Now, I'm not going to talk about the fact that maybe Ashenvale and Darkshore were meant to be one zone. I don't think they were. But again, the files and like images you can find from back then, it's kind of hard to decipher exactly what things were meant to be that early on in development. But the dungeon's location did change. But now we're going to discuss the Taurens. And that's right, they had their own dungeon. And it was a Wild West themed dungeon. I'm not sure if that meant like cowboys and shooting, but Wild West can mean many things. It might have meant more like Indians versus Indians in this case, because the Tauren are based off the natives of America, and the Razorfen Crawl and the Razorfen are based off the natives of America. I'm not exactly sure. And the Tauren starting dungeon was called Razorfen. Not Razorfen Downs, not Razorfen Crawl, Razorfen. Now, the Tauren dungeon clearly got scrapped and completely removed, and it was repurposed into Razorfen Downs and Razorfen Crawl in the future. But what was that OG dungeon meant to look like? In my personal opinion, I think the original Razorfen was meant to be the Razorfen, the Quillboar invading Mulgore, and it was meant to be this kind of standout between the Tauren trying to defend Mulgore, their homeland, versus the encroaching and invading Quillboar. Again, I'm just making shit up. I don't know what the initial idea for the OG Razorfen was meant to be, but it would have been interesting to see, because they had a lot of plans for OG vanilla World of Warcraft, and they scrapped so much of it that if they ever did finish it, if there was ever a Classic Plus with everything finished, it would be double the size of modern day vanilla, modern day Classic. And that's insane to conceptualize. But that is all 6 starter dungeons. And yes, I went into a lot of detail about these dungeons and these locations, but I could have gone into so much more. But again, I don't want to make a 2-hour video about every nitty-gritty NPC, character name, location that's name changed and whatnot. But I did promise at the beginning of the video that I was going to touch onto some mid-level dungeons that got scrapped or were changed. But I'm only going to cover 2. The first is Grimbatol, and that's right, Grimbatol was meant to have a beginner level dungeon, around the level 20 to 30 mark. Now, I'm not sure exactly what that was meant to look like, because that's the same idea, for example, as Blackrock Mountain having a level 30 or 40 dungeon inside of it. It's an endgame zone, because Grimbatol clearly had the Dragon Maw and other endgame activities designed inside of it. So the fact that they put a lower level dungeon there as well is an interesting concept, and it would have been kind of cool to see. Imagine a level 30 having a little path from like Dun Moreau or something connecting to Grimbatol. Maybe that's what the original Dwarven Highway was meant to be. What's behind the gate from Baelgar? The dungeon that connects Grimbatol all the way to Dun Moreau. Or maybe it's not. But I am doing a whole ass video about the Dark Iron Highway and its mystery and what it was actually meant to be. But that's a 2-hour video, and it's giving me an aneurysm to finish. So that'll come in the future at some point as well. But the second thing I'm going to mention is the Talon. That's right, this is a location that was completely and utterly scrapped and never came back, period whatsoever. It was located in Stone Talon. In the northwestern edge of Stone Talon was a location called the Talon. Now, what even was that meant to be? I think it was meant to be some kind of harpy matriarch, harpy old god, but again, they never went into detail and they never ever came back to it. Even in Cataclysm and onwards, the Talon was never re-explored. It was essentially forgotten about for the most part. Now, there are a couple ruins and locations in Stone Talon that could be the Talon, but the whole concept behind the Talon was never finished, and it is a frustrating thing to me because I would love to know more about old Kalimdor, old Torun lore, old Kalimdor lore, just old Azeroth in general, such an interesting and amazing place that I hope that devs someday do come back and explore the Talon in some capacity. Now, Stone Talon, like I said, was always meant to have more story, more connections, more depth to it, but Chris Metzen, based on an interview I've had with an old dev that worked at Blizzard, always liked to look forward, not back. And the quote he said was, Chris didn't even like to look at his old notes, he liked to write new ones. And so instead of looking back and finishing off a dungeon, if Chris couldn't think of a unique, original way to make something after he'd already written it the first time, he would just move on to another topic, another dungeon, another idea. He didn't really go back to finish his ideas. He would just take what his old ideas in his mind were and write newer plans, newer visions of them. And he's clearly an amazing guy considering he created the whole Warcraft universe as we know it, and we've been finishing off his old notes for the past 20 years in modern day retail. Realistically though, he probably just forgot about the Talon and then just never looked back to remember it. And that's probably what actually happened to it. Now, if you're interested in hearing more about pre-vanilla, pre-alpha, OG, post-Warcraft 3 development Azeroth, consider subscribing to the channel because I have so much more lore, so many more stories, and so many more concepts to deep dive into because I am focused on Classic Plus and the finishing of vanilla, and there are so many ideas for the devs to go back through and look at that I can't wait to share that all with everybody. So thank you all for watching. If you like this video, consider subscribing and liking. If you hate this video, like and subscribe anyways. Be a dedicated hater. Don't half-ass that shit. Thank you all. Ebonhard out. Peace.